already in session. Well, a couple of things. Welcome to the webinar discussion, Forestry and Maple. We're really pleased to have a great panel of guests. We have Tony D'Amato, Professor, Director of Forestry, and Director of UVM Research Forests. Myself will be facilitating and participating in the discussion. Addison Kasmarak from Greenleaf Forestry, licensed forester in Vermont, and also the chair of the Green Mountain Society of American Foresters chapter, and Abby Vandenberg, research associate professor and assistant director at the Proctor Maple Research Center at UVM. Any of you who are here and are looking for continuing ed credits, just know that this is available for 1 hour of category 1 credits. And if you're here, you've obviously found out about this series. We're now over halfway through a webinar series devoted to issues related to the business of making syrup, as well as the forestry side of making maple syrup. So beyond today, we have had some really interesting discussions previously, and we'll be posting the videos of those discussions all at the maplemanager.org website. The next installment will be 2 weeks from tonight, and will be tubing systems and forest management, trying to discuss issues that maple producers can deal with and ways in which their tubing systems can be designed to make forest management more easily done. And then we can move into more business type topics, and then end off the series as it's currently designed with some appraisal of sugar bushes. A lot of these resources and more are available at the Maple Manager website, so please check those out. There's a combination of business planning tools, lease guides for sugar bushes, all sorts of legal resources, and there'll be more on the forestry side of things to come. I should have also mentioned that if you are interested in getting closed captioning during tonight's live presentation, you can look in the chat box and click on that link to get that captioning service available. And we'll also have it attached to the video when that's posted. I think that covers all the housekeeping issues. We're going to keep everyone muted until we get near the end and have time for live questions. We also received questions when you registered, so we have those, and our panelists will do their best to answer those as we move along. But feel free, as other questions come up, you can type them into the chat, or if you're feeling brave, you can ask them live once we get to that point. But if you're trying to unmute yourself during the presentation, we've not allowed that at least to start. Okay, so we're going to start the discussion, I think, with just some basics, just so we're all on the same page. It may seem like review. We know from the registrations that many of you are already maple producers or prospective maple producers. But sometimes things we think we know or have pretty clear definitions of, it's good to discuss it and make sure we're all kind of looking at things either in the same way or discuss how we look at things differently. So, the first question is, what is maple sugaring? Some folks, a lot of folks have an image, perhaps the picture on the left, a fairly classic sugar bush, widely spaced, mature sugar maple trees, relatively bare in the understory, perhaps rooted more in an older style of sap collection, but sort of a more pastoral scene, you might say. And others might have a more modern version, tubing, maybe a higher density of trees per acre than you might see in the older style of sugar bush. And the reason why different people have different views is that sugaring has changed quite a bit. So first, I'd like to ask the panelists, when you hear, what is maple sugaring, perhaps contribute a thought or two to that question. And if you have anything to add, you can. Otherwise, we can keep rolling. That's totally fine. In general, the practice of sugaring is the act of harvesting the sap from the maple forest, and how we've approached it has changed. And what I did want to share is a slide looking at maybe some of the reasons how these processes have changed. And this slide is for Vermont, but it definitely reflects what we see in other parts of the maple world, and that production had a really high moment about 100 years ago. A lot of folks see that period of decline overlapping with farm abandonment and a change from more of an agrarian economy to more of a manufacturing economy, and more farms being given up. And I'm sure that piques the interest of foresters, because a lot of forests that are out there, are the result of some of this farm abandonment. In terms of maple, we had a long period where there was relatively flat production. In the period we're in now, I think we can all agree is an expansion, somewhat rapid, given how short it's happened. So, any perspective on that? As far as your experience with stands you work with, or how you see landowners approaching forestry?
I guess just one comment on that, Mark, in terms of that abandonment, and especially following such a high emphasis on maple, really led to a lot of maple colonizing these areas post-agricultural abandonment. And so I think in many cases, the stands we're tapping today and the maple resource we have today is in many cases an artifact of that past land use. And so when we think about suitability of a given site for maple, and also just how quote unquote natural is that maple condition, so much of it goes back to this earlier period. And I think that's always an important point of reflection when we're thinking about what sites make sense for long-term production versus possibly some other uses.
All right. I choose to put this up just because we are talking about something different than cutting trees for timber production. That maple, as we're defining it, is a non-timber forest product. So it's the sap itself that we're harvesting, not the tree. And when we have asked, when we asked professional foresters who work with maple producers recently in a survey, these were the results we got from the question of what type of land use is maple sugaring? Is it purely a forestry activity? Is it purely agriculture? Or is it a mix of both? This might be a good opportunity for you guys to respond or have a comment on how this sort of perspective from the forestry community might resonate with you.
Yeah, I'll jump in. So certainly from working with landowners, there's a rub, not really a rub, but definitely a rift between folks who see their sugar bushes as crop and those who see their sugar bushes as working forest, as a productive forest, with different elements, not just sap. So it runs the scale between the folks who think more of a crop and those who think more of a forest. There's folks who run on that spectrum, but it's really difficult to not necessarily convince, but have a conversation with someone who thinks of their sugar bush as a crop, to have a conversation with that type of person with that type of mentality, trying to look at their forest as a forest that you can manage versus a sap producer, basically. So that's certainly interesting that the results of this survey. Yeah, I guess that's just some little input from me.
Sure. Again, these respondents were foresters who work with maple producers, so they're certainly aware of it. So maybe we could talk a little bit about forestry and make sure folks are kind of on the same page, or have some sense of what forestry is and how it might relate to maple. These are some pretty broad definitions, obviously. I guess my question, given the differences here, we have sort of the broad practice, but then we also have the actual activities on the ground that you might do to put pressure on one composition in favoring one versus the other. I guess I'd be curious to hear what your approach is to silviculture in sugar bushes and how you might view it differently than northern hardwood stand silviculture.
Yeah, I think, just going back to Addison's previous point, and I think part of this work for some of us that maybe are more trained traditionally in forestry is that when you look at a sugar bush, because it's a collection of trees, it's a forest stand, I think all of us that are trained in forestry often have a certain set of values and outcomes that they expect to see from that, from a very traditional perspective in terms of production of products that take 50 to 100 to 150 years to produce, and that quality matters, and all these things, and so I think over the past 10 years or so, there's been a bit more of a reconciliation with people are sugaring, and sugaring might be the primary output from the stand. So how do we balance some of those other goals we have for forests with that important output that, again, some of us might view as more agricultural? And so from a silvicultural standpoint, the goal is always trying to balance multiple objectives. It's never, we've learned a long time ago, if you just maximize one output, you're going to compromise a lot of other important things. And so the same goes for, producing sap. Yes, you can certainly focus some of that production on your best trees and in a high proportion of trees in there, but doing it in a way that really is maintaining that ecosystem and the function of that ecosystem, so that there's resilience to pests, there's diversity of other species. And so if we want to package it in kind of the lens that we look at forestry, multiple benefits is really where we view how we view the forest, certainly economics being a key driver, but never going just to maximize that production unless it's like a true plantation or something like that. So,
any other perspectives you want to chime in on? All right. So I guess, kind of going from those basic definitions, thinking a little bit more about forest management and, how you go about implementing it and why you might go about implementing it. Here's a picture, a relatively small, it's probably 8-inch sugar maple that had sugar maple borer damage before, clearly before the sugar bush was put up, because this was relatively brand new tubing. Maybe you can talk a little bit about your approach and how you might look at, you mentioned quality, Tony. So what are some things that you would look at if you're going to a stand that a producer or a landowner is saying, I want to get into maple? What are some of the key things you're going to talk to them about in terms of making the forest management on that sugar bush good quality and long lasting?
So it actually, I can answer it, but I might defer to Addison, just given she works a lot with landowners around this, but I can chime in after, if you're all right, Addison, taking this one, just given your work with this stuff.
Yeah, this is such a common sight. This could have come from any one of my clients' properties. So longevity is a difficult characteristic to discuss with some sugar makers, because sugaring is such a short term. It has an annualized return. So several landowners I work with who have sugaring as a management objective, they're interested in how many taps can they get set up as quickly as possible, and not necessarily thinking about 10, 20, 30 years from now. So the first thing that I do when I engage a landowner in a conversation about how to manage a stand like this, mid-successional agricultural abandonment stand, you got your white pine component in there, et cetera, is what are our soils what are our soils, what's really going to grow here, what's meant to grow here, and kind of look at it in that context. And then off of that conversation, we can talk about enhancing structural complexity, so retaining different size classes if we are going to implement any kind of treatment. Looking out for things like pests, like you mentioned, Mark, forest health conditions, structural conditions of the trees. Were they coppiced? Do they have several stems coming off of the root base? And then from there, we can talk about actual silvicultural forest management implementation. Several of these stands, because there's a higher component of maple, aren't actually commercially feasible to cut, because the landowner wants to retain as much maple as possible, which reduces the number of trees that you can actually cut, even though you should be cutting maple in many of these circumstances. So that's a whole separate, piece of it. But, just starting on those base blocks of what you have today isn't necessarily what you're going to have 50, 60 years from now. And that's important, not only for your yield, but also for the longevity and productivity and resiliency of your sugar bush. But those are, these are heavy hitting conversations that sometimes just go right over the head, but when they stick, and it's really satisfying. But I'll defer to anyone else on the panel to add to that.
Yeah, I guess just to, to build on that longevity piece, if you want this to be a productive sugar bush with a, high annual output, it's looking at those individual trees like this one that snapped. I mean, from a traditional forest product standpoint, when we're marking stands for long-term production of high quality wood, we're selecting trees to remove based on risk. What tree is not likely going to be there, 10 years, 15 years from now. And so does it make sense to remove that tree? The same goes for, if we want that tree to be a solid producer over time, from a sap production, crown form, are there things in that crown that might predispose it to ice damage, or does it just have a poorly formed crown that suggests it's not going to be able to put on growth like other trees? And then in this situation, even just looking at that stand, as Addison mentioned, cutting maple actually would be a really good thing for improving the maple on that site. And that high density situation, even though that's going to give you a lot of taps, at this point in time, over time, those trees, in terms of their crown development, their ability to grow and put on wood, and have that stability and vigor, is going to be much lower than if you actually could intervene and select for the top crop trees and manage those as part of the sugar bush, as opposed to just trying to have as many mouths to feed with taps as possible at this point in time.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that about cutting, because several of the questions that came in during registration were in that same vein of how do I choose what trees to cut? When is it appropriate to cut a maple? How do you convince someone that it's okay to cut a maple? Abby, I happen to know a little something about growth rates and sugar maple and tap stands. I wonder if there's a place here to comment on crown position and just what the science is, what is available in terms of growth rates and how that might play into forest management. Nothing, not to put you on the spot, but
tiny stuff. No, I mean, what we see in our maple stands or in tap maple stands is what we would see in any other type of stands. Trees that are too crowded do not grow very well. And that is, that has to do, we see with obviously high stand density, but that is also impacted by position in the crown. So trees that are also, subdominant below the main canopy are also growing super slow relative to their neighbors. And what we see a lot of times in maple stands, especially if you have a producer that really doesn't want to cut a maple tree, one of the most tempting things there is to tap those smaller trees that are in the subdominant canopy, because they're there and they're a potentially tappable size. And so because the growth rates of trees end up being so important to making sure there's enough clean wood to tap into, it's really kind of shooting sap yields in the foot in the long run by not doing some management activities to keep those growth rates actually increasing and adding those crop trees adding good new wood.
Yeah, I know we led in with a discussion of sort of historical methods and, used to be buckets and moved rapidly into modern sugaring. But one thing I try to point out all the time is that the one thing buckets really gave you is a good sense of what individual trees were producing. And one thing that tubing takes away is that individual tree understanding. So, just because you have a tap in a tree you don't necessarily know how much that's contributing to your overall yield. So unfortunately, you can have 20,000 taps, but you don't know what each of those is contributing to your total or potentially taking away and drawing down your average yield. Anything else you want to add on that, Addison or Abby or anyone?
I was just going to add, tag on to what you just said, that of course we, while we may not be aware of individual yields like we have been in the past in a bucket system, we do know that smaller trees make less sap. So, if you are tapping those trees that maybe should be cut instead, you're not getting a lot of bang for your buck even in year one.
Right.
And there was a question that came in the chat in terms of thinning on individual tree yield. Does that translate to kind of stand level of per acre yield? And so I think, if you were to walk on a stand today and thin, the yield that year is going to be less than if you tapped every one of those trees. But really the key is over the long term, by not thinning, you're really compromising the potential for high stand level yield for the reasons that Abby pointed out, because you can't really rebuild that tree and put a big crown on it after it's been suppressed for 20 years at a high density situation. And the same goes for clear wood production. So by gaining that clear wood production and gaining it across much of that stand, that really would allow you longer term high yield that you might compromise in any given year with that thinning operation. So there's a trade-off in terms of max, and it's the same goes for wood production. You could pack trees in that stand, but we know by thinning we're actually kind of gaining more of that higher quality production over time by doing that.
Addison, what's the range you see in taps per acre? I mean, it must be all over the place, but maybe you can shed a little light on that, given our discussion about, taps per acre.
Yep. So generally speaking, a commercially viable sugar bush has somewhere between 40 and 70 taps to the acre. So when we see a stand that has somewhere around 30 or 20, I don't tend to classify that as a commercially viable sugar bush. I have several sugar makers who would disagree with me on that, but it's typically in that like 50 to 60 range that I classify it as commercial. There are certainly clients of mine who have 100, 150 taps to the acre over several hundred acres. And in those situations, that's usually where the landowner has taken an approach of tapping to kill, which is a term that I'm sure all the panelists have heard. Maybe some of our participants haven't. So those trees that are lacking vigor, very unhealthy, maybe the bark's peeling off, they're just really not doing well. Some sugar makers will tap those trees rather than cut those trees because the philosophy is they can garner sap from that tree while it's still alive, barely, instead of just cutting it. And that's, again, that short-term annualized income that I was talking about earlier. It's very appealing to some folks. But of course, the drawback to that is what Tony and Abby were referring to and alluding to, is that when you have those higher vigor, healthier maple that are doing really well and have kind of an upper hand, what you're doing by leaving those poorer quality, less vigorous trees is you're taking away nutrients in the capacity of those trees to continue to develop into high quality, long living, vigorous stems and trees. It's survival of the fittest is another term that sugar makers throw at me. Well, I'm just going to let them out compete and the strongest will survive. But we have these forestry tools for a reason. They're not novel concepts. Forest management's not novel. And as we learn more about sugaring and yields, from these healthier, faster growing, more vigorous trees, that the science is backing up removing those low quality stems. There was a question that just came in on the text, the chat, what is the benefit to leaving smaller trees in the subcanopy? And I can just give a quick answer to that and then let the other panelists answer that too. But when we talk about a healthy, vigorous stand, we talk about a stand that has complexity in structure and in species composition. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One reason I'll point to, and I'll let the other panelists pitch in too, is when you, and I'm not sure if this person's, if you're asking about like saplings or poles, but I'll just talk about regeneration in general. Smaller trees are crucial to the long-term, they're a vital component of our forests, so we need them to be a constant in a stand so that there's always the next generations developing and producing into larger size classes. But I'll let others take the wheel here on that.
Yeah, I think, the most unsatisfying answer is always it depends, but, some of those smaller stems, if it's an even age, if it's all one age class, some of those smaller suppressed stems could be like weaker competitors. But to Addison's point, a lot of times the smaller suppressed stems are actually a key part of kind of the resilience mechanism of that forest. So having kind of new stems to replace those mature stems when they succumb. And so I think, one of the challenges sometimes from a forestry or silviculture standpoint, when we see pictures like Mark showed of that nice sugar bush with scattered, widely spaced trees and then nothing beneath them, to us, it's a very vulnerable condition in that, one of the sugar maples goes down, there's really nothing there to take its place and kind of give you a new cohort of sugar maple to in maybe, 80 years be kind of the next habitable tree in that spot. And so those smaller trees really play an important insurance function in the forest. It's just kind of having future maple out there. And as we deal with more stressors, whether it's deer, earthworms, climate change, invasives, I'm always happy to have an established tree out in the forest because we don't know what next year is going to bring in terms of future conditions. And so being able to work with that regeneration, particularly if it's maple and it's what you're interested in, that's great. But even if it's not maple, and providing that diversity component and that complexity is really important. And so those smaller stems really are critical to have in those stands. Through the eyes of a forestry person.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing I'll add is that sugar maple is widely seen as a very shade tolerant species, but shade tolerance isn't the same as shade loving. I mean, no plant loves shade necessarily. So I think there's a limit too where you start to have an understory that's been in the understory for a long time. You start seeing changes in the flattening of the crown, and that might be something that a forester might look at and say, maybe it's a chance. What is there above this tree or this group of very small trees that we can look at as maybe potential for really removal and then bringing that next age cohort along. So I mean, there is a point at which the morphology, the shape of that is going to prevent it from ever reaching the canopy and being that next part of the dominant canopy. So
no, and there's been some good work from Quebec looking at saplings that were highly suppressed individuals and then tracked over time, and those tended to develop into trees with high levels of defect, and so there is definitely some trade-off even there. We're maple-like shade, but generally like 2 to 3 release events tops is kind of what is kind of the progression of that tree into the overstory. So.
Yep. So we're going to move on, and we're going to kind of talk a little bit more about the nuts and bolts of the forestry side of things. So sort of the developing a plan, and I know we've already covered some of it, but I wanted to make sure that people understood, what's involved in hiring a consulting forester. What are the things that they're going to bring that you couldn't do on your own, and maybe how the goals of a sugar maker might differ from goals of a landowner who's looking for long-term timber production. So obviously we have some expertise here, and thought to start off, I might ask Addison, how do you go about sampling in an initial inventory? Do you go into it differently than you would in any other type of stand, given that, like you've mentioned a few times, that annual income is very different from what you might see in a traditional northern hardwoods management plan. You could talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts of the inventory process and working with a landowner on developing a plan.
Sure. So my approach doesn't really change whether the landowner objective is sugaring or timber, with other sub objectives like wildlife. The first conversation to have is what are the objectives. There's usually secondary, tertiary objectives, and the inventory. As much as I wish I could say it's different, it's the same. I'm walking through plastic. And it's a systematic inventory, grid inventory. I go out, and sometimes the landowner joins me, sometimes not. It's their choice. If there's 8 feet of snow, they tend to not want to go with me. And I collect the data to run the numbers, if you will, to crunch the numbers. And what the landowner ends up with is a report of what they have as far as species composition, stalking, basal area. These are just forestry terminology for quantifying what you have in your forest. And after I have that baseline data, then I talk to my client, the landowner, and discuss management options. Sometimes it's no cutting. Sometimes it's controlling invasives is the most important management priority. Sometimes it's a non-commercial thinning, or sometimes it's a commercial harvest or thinning. And there are a lot of variables in sub conversations that branch off of that conversation. Like, for example, if a commercial harvest is recommended, well, then we need to talk about when are the lines coming down? Are the lines coming down? Where's our landing? We don't want to interfere with your infrastructure. So certainly the inventory piece is pretty much the same. The plan development piece is the same as any other objective, but the implementation and planning for a silvicultural treatment is dramatically different because of your restrictions with the infrastructure of the sugar bush.
All right. Does anyone want to chime in and talk about maybe how differences in tree quality? I'll put, that's a pretty broad bucket, or a large topic, but maybe talk a little bit about what makes an ideal maple tree. How does that differ from for sap production, I should say, and how a plan might differ if your long-term goal is sap production versus clear, straight maple lumber. Anyone want to take that one? We'll have to talk about it once we get to regulations. So.
I guess I can just say, this keeps coming back to it. The lens that we look at the forest is, more from, we're producing dimensional lumber or some sort of low value timber product. And so it's through the eyes of acceptable growing stock versus unacceptable growing stock, as defined as to what would go into, producing a nice veneer log versus what could be totally crooked, but could really produce a lot of sap. And so I think, it is different, in terms of how we look at that. And there's actually, some positives there from the production standpoint of sap, and that, forestry certainly not perfect, even though we're trying to make it sound that way. And that there's, you can go too far in removing a lot of what we would consider unacceptable growing stock, trees with cavities in them or crooked trees that actually are really important for biodiversity. And so some of those trees that are important for biodiversity while still living can be tapped and actually still be producing output. And so I think there's actually some places where sugaring will retain trees that have much higher biodiversity benefit that we would have historically just gotten rid of from a true forest product standpoint, because they're taking up growing space from higher quality individuals in a very traditional sense.
All right. I'm going to move on here. We had an interesting result from another survey we did looking, this time asking maple producers, do you follow a management plan written by a professional forester? And these were the results. So these were not just Vermont producers, this was Northeast and elsewhere, which is interesting. You know, I think that you certainly have some room to grow your clientele, Addison, if you so choose. Anyone surprised by this, or does this result warrant any response, or should I just go on?
I am a little surprised by that. I think it may reflect the geographic diversity of the sample. You know, just thinking about producers in Vermont who have a sugar bush of any size are generally going to be enrolled in either current use or, and there's a high likelihood of them being certified organic, both of which would require a plan written by a professional forester. So
Yeah, for sure. This is definitely all respondents. So this includes producers below a size that would even qualify for a program like UVA. So yeah. All right. Any other comments? Addison, looked like you were ready to say something.
Yeah, this breaks my heart. I just had to say, but you know, it's very interesting. Most of the plans that we prepare for sugar makers, that I prepare for sugar makers, are driven by current use, UVA, or an organic program. And it's more seen as, the plan is seen more as a utility sometimes than actually a plan for them to follow and be thinking about. Certainly there are exceptions. That's a broad generalization. But several sugar makers that I work with see the plan not as a plan, but more of a utility or a means to an end for either certification or for current use. So this is sad, but I'm not surprised.
No, and this is just a one little snapshot. When we produce more information from this survey, I think you're going to see that, you know, the larger operations, it's a much higher percentage of saying yes, like Abby said, you know, because of it's important for property tax savings and other things. So just a thought piece to get us talking. So I guess, you know, I want to talk a little bit about implementing plans. You know, we talked a little bit about it already, for sure. But, you know, what does good management look like? Maybe the intervals. You know, does it differ if it's in a maple operation versus northern hardwoods? And then how do things like the road system and things to manage how water flows across the property? You know, how do you approach those differently, considering that along with that annual income, maple producers are also entering the woods much more frequently than they would maybe in a more traditional northern hardwood stand. Maybe I'll pick on Abby to see what you think of this, and if there's anything that comes to mind when you think of you know, how sugar makers might go about implementing a plan, and while not, you know, working around their tubing system. What would you suggest?
That is a really good question. I mean, obviously, just like Addison alluded to earlier, it's like the first thing that you're thinking about when you're implementing or even deciding what your silvicultural treatments are going to be or how you're going to do them is, what is the tubing infrastructure there, and what is the road structure there, and how do you kind of work around it if you already have that. Yeah, I don't know that I have too much to add there other than that tubing systems shouldn't be such a grand deterrent to to thinning or any kind of silvicultural treatment. They can be worked around, and that in general, we think of the lifetime of tubing systems, you know, just from a purely maple sap production standpoint. Excuse me. generally the lifespan of a lateral line system is going to be somewhere like maybe in the neighborhood of 5 to 10 years. Main lines a little longer than that potentially, but not necessarily, given that they can break down. So those are just kind of like rules of thumb, I guess, to kind of think about intervals, but they're not really hard and fast. I don't know. If you were pitching me a softball there for something you wanted me to say, Mark, I totally did not get it.
No, that was great. That was great. I mean, we can get into this in the next slide too, but I guess, you know, the issue of road system and culverts and water bars and stuff, Addison, maybe I'll pick on you next. You know, is there a particular approach you might take, knowing that those roads are going to be used at a much higher frequency, given that it's a maple operation? Or would you recommend that a maple producer do maybe a little bit more work on the road infrastructure versus one where you're just going to be getting in for when the harvest is called for by the plan?
Yeah, so roads are certainly a pretty big bucket to unload. So usually the road system that sugar makers use are pre-existing skid trails, and they've expanded out from those pre-existing skid trails because most of our forests around here have some skid trail system already, just because of history of cutting. But certainly because of the time of year that sugar makers are working in the woods, the roads do need to have more TLC, water erosion prevention measures, you know, a crossing that we might be able to put a temporary crossing, a stream crossing in when we're doing logging might need a more permanent solution for sugaring because of the frequency and intensity of the use. But, you know, as far as the main lines, you know, and the replacement that Abby was just speaking about, one of the complaints that I get, and I'll just say this, I know we want to move on to the next slide. One of the things I'll say is, one of the complaints I get from sugar makers with planning a timber sale, a silvicultural treatment, is, well, if I cut, then I'm going to have to reroute my main lines because the trees are going to be, my taps aren't going to be in the same orientation or the same location, so I'm going to need to change where I move them. And this is in a situation where we're actually cutting maple. So that's something else to be thinking about when I'm talking with them is, well, yes, the main lines can be replaced, but they already have their layout, they already have their flow of their sugar bush, and they don't want that. There might be some friction there with wanting or needing to change that layout, not just the lines. I just wanted to mention that too.
Okay, great. Thanks. All right. I did want to bring up, you know, I just changed the picture here, you know, the idea of the temptation to do more than what's maybe called for in one entry into the woods as far as thinning or doing any sort of cutting, you know, kind of the idea that a little bit of thinning is good, so a lot must be better. You know, here's a stand where, you know, probably opened up a little bit too much and end up with, you know, a fair amount of fern. And I guess, you know, maybe each of you can at least add something to the idea of how do you balance the intensity versus, you know, not going too far, given that infrastructure we just talked about is being, it's certainly not a benefit to getting access, so it is a bit of an impediment. How might you approach your prescriptions accordingly, or would you make any changes at all to how you approach it? Or I guess, how do you put the brakes on if, you know, a landowner is hoping to do 2 or 3 rounds of thinning at once? What's your advice there?
So, you know, I guess this is a case where, you know, moving from that individual tree level thinking to the, you know, stand level production thinking is important. And again, like, we know we could grow 10 open grown trees and those individual trees are going to grow really well, but like the stand level production actually is below optimum because you're not fully utilizing the space. And so, you know, via, you know, over a century of work looking at what stocking levels work best for growth. There are some pretty good standards that folks can use, based on northern hardwood stocking levels that give you at least a good approximation of a basal area value you probably don't want to go below if you're trying to maximize stand level production. And that production level is not, based on a lot of tightly packed trees. It's kind of optimal growth of many crop trees across the site. And so really using those as benchmarks, I think makes a lot of sense. But also, when you're making decisions about marking trees, that you are focusing on crop tree growth. So, we've talked about a lot before, crop tree release treatments, where you're not opening up every single tree in that stand, but maybe 50 to 75, or depending on the age of the stand, or even 100 to 200 if it's a younger stand, trees per acre, where you're just focusing in on your best growers and increasing growing space around them, but ignoring things in between, partly because, you don't need to eliminate those competitors, but also that's important insurance too, to have that stocking out there in case you do lose some of those individuals. And so that's generally how we approach things. But I do, given that there's the infrastructure component to it, thinking a little bit about, do I want to make them, if this is a one time, I know I'm going to be cutting trees in the next, 15 years, like doing it in a way that's certainly thoughtful and not too aggressive, but also is not going the other direction where you're just going to cut a few trees and then regret from a vigor perspective that you didn't remove enough. And so using those stocking guides that, really were designed more for silvicultural purposes, apply quite well also for avoiding the situation that you have in this picture here, which is just getting the hair in the back of my neck up a little bit. But this is a big birch there.
All right, thanks. So, we'll talk a little bit now about regulations and how they might impact sugar makers and how, I guess your perspective on it. And, this picture here, we've got a couple of county foresters talking water bars. That shape, that little triangle shape there, is actually demonstrating what an appropriate angle for a water bar would be to function, to actually get that water off the road. It's in an active sugar bush. So maybe, we could talk a little bit about AMPs and how they might impact sugar makers. And we did talk a little bit about that in terms of the road system, but maybe talk a little bit more about how UVA in Vermont and things like 480A in New York, or other property tax abatement programs as they relate to sugaring, and how those regulations might shape how their forestry is done. Anyone have any comments there?
Well, I know certainly when UVA came out with the sugar bush standards, which I believe were like 2015, was that 2015, Mark?
2014, I think, yeah.
2014, okay. And that set a minimum diameter for taps, DBH for taps. That really changed things, really put it into people's minds when they were reading their plan, seeing those actual standards. Because, you can tell someone a million times something, but then when they see it as kind of a rule or a standard, it changes their perception a little bit. That was a big game changer. I think the AMPs are so crucial in a sugar bush because the time of year that the trails are being used, mud season, they can really take a beating. So even going above and beyond the AMPs, is beneficial, and saves the sugar maker money in the long run to prevent serious road improvements. The other piece of this is that in UVA, at least in Vermont UVA, you can enroll your sugar bush as ag and therefore not needing a forest management plan, which we do see some landowners do so that they don't feel restricted as far as their management goes in their sugar bush. But with the organic certification, which necessitates a forest management plan, we've seen a big shift of folks more even not even needing the organic, but more folks just being interested in forest management. Your tax break is a little higher if you're in forestry versus ag in Vermont. But I think that it's a boon rather than a bane. The current use program with sugar makers and sugar bushes in Vermont.
Right.
I might just add too, beyond maintaining water quality and access, I think, as we see more and more folks sugaring, and more people in the general public looking at, water quality issues and some of these intersections between land use practices and water quality. Maintaining our social license to sugar, part of that is showing that we're doing what we know are best practices for maintaining water quality when we're out in times of year where a logger would not typically be out there on roads and equipment. And so in many cases, it's even more important to be applying these AMPs. It's more important to be right-sizing culverts, using permanent crossings like Addison brought up, and that people are, at this point, I would say still very excited about sugaring as a practice in the landscape. But, if there are more and more water quality issues that get linked to not using AMPs on certain properties, it's certainly going to influence perceptions. And that's something some people in the forestry community can speak to a lot from personal perspective. Many of these are developed in the first place because of abuse of, water quality and soil issues. And so I think, the sugaring community can learn that, it might make sense to be proactive with these, and in many cases try to develop some AMPs that are tailored to the situations they're working with, that are a bit different than typical logging operation in the forest.
It's nice to have that historical perspective for sure. I think I put in the bullet point about discharge from sugar houses. Obviously, that's not necessarily not all sugar houses are in the sugar bush, but it does seem from what I'm hearing is that there is a move towards looking a little bit more at those discharges, primarily on the volume side, being the RO permeate discharge that happens when you're concentrating sap, and to maybe another extent the chemicals, the acids and bases used to maintain that equipment. So just something to think about. There isn't anything necessarily beyond the normal water quality regulation that everyone has to adhere to regardless of what you're doing. You can't pollute the waters of the state and that sort of thing. But anyway, I just put that in there. We are getting close on time. As I sort of thought time would fly. I know we haven't answered all the questions, so maybe we can start the final question answering portion by that nice big softball that we got about sap flow. So for those of you who did not see it, there's a question that asks, do you have any data on the conjunction of sap flow rates when it's a few degrees above freezing yet snowing compared to slightly above freezing and raining? Our experience shows the snowing situation has substantially higher flow rates, but we have not found any explanation as to why. And I'm going to ask Abby to take this one right down the middle of the plate. And
if the person that answered this question or that asked this question is here, I would love for you to be unmuted so that I could ask some more questions about the question. But generally, I think what this question speaks to is that, especially when it gets around the freezing point or what we perceive as the freezing point, things get really weird with the tree, because everything that's going on in the tree is being affected by temperature changes, not only at the base of the tree or where we're walking around the woods, but also, predominantly in the fine branches, which are at a very different temperature than what we're seeing on the ground. So you often have some disconnect between what you're observing at the sap tank and what's actually going on in the woods, and in different parts of your woods for that matter. And then I'm going to stop there and let that person speak up if they're here.
Yeah, maybe Tom, maybe we can get the folks.
This is Mark. I just gave everyone you have the power now to unmute yourselves. So
okay. If
you have questions or discussion, you can unclick that or click the microphone into the unmute feature.
So if you're the one who asked that question and are on the call, why don't you? And
if they're not here, we can just move on.
Sure. I'll give them a second or two. Anyone? No? Okay. The next question is, how do you see global warming, climate change affecting the viability of maple businesses over the next few decades?
Are you going to take that?
Well, I thought I'd give the panelists a chance to take it.
I
No
mean,
one?
from my perspective, since I'm already unmuted, from my perspective, especially just over the next few decades, in that kind of time frame, I, especially in the northeastern U.S., don't see any of our any of the major effects of climate change majorly affecting sap and syrup production and maple production because of the way that technology is evolving to allow us to adapt to changing climate regimes, unpredictable climate regimes. Basically, everything we're doing with technology in maple production is allowing us to mitigate against most of the sort of near-term impacts of climate change. That said, the unpredictable occurrence of a brand new invasive species that was pretty much fostered here because of climate change changes that answer completely. So
I definitely agree that timescale is important. So since the questioner said a couple of decades, I think it's a little bit easier to have an opinion. I will say that a year like 2012, where we had 5 days in the 70s in March, is really, in my mind, one of the biggest threats. Whether or not you can tie that directly to climate change or not, it's certainly the thing that in the short term is going to have the biggest impact for a maple producer. And there really isn't a whole lot that I can think of that a maple producer is going to be able to do to ward against that. I think if you are in places outside the Northeast in historically cold climates, I don't think you should be wed to a historical period of time for tapping. You should be looking at what the climate is where you are now and take all the information that's out there about tapping and just don't be tied to a particular calendar day or month or year, day, week, or month. Look outside and see what's happening in your area historically right now. Okay, so
there's a question in the chat window that's actually a pretty good one.
Okay.
I guess most of you can probably read this, but I'm considering using goats to browse back invasives. Should I include managed grazing for a heavily mapled area that we'd like to develop into a sugar bush? And I'm not sure, I would love to hear what the other panelists say, but in my opinion and my experience, hell no. Grazing can be really heavily impactful. I mean, goats are not cattle, but you can really heavily impact this forest soils in that way. And in fact, one of the only documented research studies that has found an impact of tapping on trees was in a grazed maple stand. So it had maybe more to do with the grazing than the impact of tapping. So I would say, I would caution against grazing within the actual sugar bush area of your land. But I'd love to hear what the other panelists had to say.
Yeah, I think it's tricky from the invasives perspective in that, your other alternatives, you're, either using herbicides or you're doing like lots and lots of, mechanical treatments on your own. And so I know in some areas they started using goats as a way to deal with buckthorn. And to Abby's point, I think, in small doses, if the goal is really just to knock back the invasives and then never graze in there again, to just kind of have it as a an all-out assault, not just in the invasives, but anything else that's growing in there because they're goats, that makes a lot of sense. But, for a long-term sustainability perspective, I think there's a real challenge. And those of us that have been exposed to this and more traditional forestry stands often view it, it's a good maybe 2 to 3 year strategy, get rid of the invasives if you can, or at least set them back. And then, at that point, allow the forest to start developing and growing because they're just going to keep eating everything. And to Abby's point, impacting that soil over time.
Yeah, and I'll just add really quickly, with invasives, there are a lot of options. I do not ever recommend grazing in a forest of any kind. I mean, there's silvopasture, which is a mixture of grazing and forestry. That is a very complex system. and it's very it has a lot of different variables. So when you talk about grazing and forestry, even with non-timber products like sap, it's very, very sketchy to say the least. But certainly I have conversations with landowners about invasive control. Grazing is never an option that I would recommend.
All right. I know we're getting close on time, but I'd like to keep going if we can. If you guys can stick around a little bit longer to get through these questions, that'd be great. Question that came in early on the registration: would you rather see a maple bush 100% sugar maples or a lesser extent and other species encouraged? I think we did talk about that a bit, but does anyone want to have any final thoughts on the diversity standpoint? I will say that some of the research that went into finding that kind of magic percentage of 20–25% non-sugar maple, some of that work was specifically looking at sugar maple pests, sugar maple specific pests. So that is important. And the other thing that sometimes is overlooked is how much red maple can contribute to that diversity. Again, in a stand where red maple is competitive, it can be an important part. Any other questions on or comments on diversity? All right. Question, I think we talked about this fairly well, but in case there's anything else, how do you assess the quality of a maple stand to evaluate it if it's a good candidate for sugaring? On a young stand that has not been tapped, how would I assess output potential to create a business plan? Well, you have to wait a little bit for some of the work we're working on, trying to actually use some inventory data to project that. But anyone want to comment on that? The one thing I will point out, and Tony alluded to it earlier, is historical patterns of land use can obscure a little bit of what a stand might potentially grow. Like you could have an area where it's been favored to be sugar maple, and outwardly, wow, I got a lot of sugar maple here, this must be a sugar maple stand. It could have more to do with historic patterns of land use and exclusion of other species. So I think it's important to look beyond just what's growing at that moment in time. So when the question is about assessing quality of a maple stand, make sure that that stand is in fact, really primed for growing maple in the first place.
And I would add to that just that, the best starting place there is, oh, Tony, do you want to go ahead?
I was going to say is for the climate change piece, making sure the site can support maple for the next 100 years is even more important. So I think it really becomes critical to focus in, to your point, Mark, is this an artifact of past land use that is a condition we're never going to see again, or is it really a site that we know can be, we'll consider a climate refuge for the species? So really thinking about that longer term sustainability becomes more important too at that stage. Sorry, Abby.
Oh, not at all. I was going to take it just to an even more generic answer in that I think the best, if you are in this situation, one of the best first steps to take is to work with a professional forester that has experience in sugaring, because it's such a complex issue of site, even if things like elevation and the actual trees that you have there, and they're going to be the best equipped to know the right questions to ask, know the right variables to look at, and that would be a good starting place. And then there are a couple of different resources available that have just the kind of things to be thinking about when you're looking at a stand, whether it's roads or site factors like elevation and soils and things like that, that are available online at mapleresearch.org. You can check it out. So that's what I would say. You can save yourself probably a lot of mental frustration by working with somebody that really has experience with that from the beginning.
Awesome, thanks. We did have a question about controlling beach in the understory. Anyone have the silver bullet they want to share with the world?
I don't know if you don't want to cut maple. Actually, yellow birch usually works pretty well, but yeah, it's a tricky one. I mean, I think it's again site dependent in terms of how big of an issue it is, and if you're seeing a really heavy beach competition issue. In some cases, that's probably pushing it away from being a good maple site in general. But yeah, there's some really good materials that Pete Smollett has developed on folks want to go the herbicide route on how to effectively use herbicides for beech control. But yeah, repeated brush saw removal, and in some cases, just figuring out how much you can live with if you're not willing to cut and get other species established in those places. I don't know, Addison, if you have a different perspective on it, but it's
a very difficult problem once you have it. If you don't have it, that's the best position to be in, because then you can work with someone like me or another professional forester to develop a plan that will discourage beech. Certain silvicultural treatments promote it and others discourage it. And it is, as Tony was just saying, very site dependent. It comes down to soils, aspect, elevation, past land use history, so many things. And if you don't have beech, then you're very lucky, and try to keep it that way. But I wish I had a silver bullet to get rid of it. I don't.
Great, thank you. Go back to the chat here. A question from Daniel. Where would you recommend for a maple producer to look for guidance on forestry services that understand the goals of sugaring, but also supporting sustainable growth of the forest?
So there are several resources. You can look up licensed foresters. I don't know what state, Dan, you're in, if you want to jump in, unmute yourself, where you're coming from.
In Vermont, it looks like.
Okay. So yeah, you can look up licensed foresters in the state. You can also look at SAF's website. They have a directory of certified foresters, which is a national recognition. And Northern Woodlands has a host of foresters with credentials. So there's lots of resources available for you to look up a forester in your area.
Here's a good one. This one might take a while to answer, so we might have to just keep it at a pretty high level answer. But generally, if a landowner wants to maximize long-term revenue, is logging or sugar bush lease more attractive? And they add $1 per tap, say, for lease rate.
Yeah, I think it's a tricky one. And as Mark responded, Mark Cannella responded, this is one we're actually going to try to be working on to update and get a better handle on this, because it's, yeah, I think that many of our discussions today were around the annual output versus long-term as it relates to different products. And so I think it's a critical question.
And I would just add to Tony's comment that it's very site specific. So some stands are highly, highly productive for timber. Other stands are not so much. And so depending on the type of stand you have, there's a lot of variables there. But certainly there are stands I walk into that I discourage the landowner from tapping because it's growing such high quality timber. But it is hard to dissuade someone from, if they have 5,000 taps, that's $5,000 a year, versus a timber harvest that might bring them $5,000 in revenue if they wait 10 to 20 or 30 years for a treatment. So it's a matter of scale and what you have for resources.
It didn't come up with this discussion, but occasionally we'll talk about multiple uses. So we might actually, if you have identified a few really potential high quality individuals, it is potentially possible to flag those and not tap them within an existing sugar bush. Do you ever see that, or is that really just it never happens in practice, Addison?
I've never seen that myself, no. I've actually, yeah, I won't even go down that road, but it's something I've never seen. Unfortunately, when you're setting up a line, you're setting up your sugar bush, a maple's a maple.
I appreciate Mark Cannella for adding to the chat too, and going back to that sort of provocative pie chart that I put out there about who follows plans written by professional foresters and who don't and who doesn't. He added that the average acreage for the folks who do use a plan is 163 acres. Then the folks who don't have a plan is less than half that at 71 acres. So I think once we do a little more analysis on that work, I think that trend will continue. You'll see that some of the bigger operations will have it for the various reasons that we talked about earlier. So, all right, well, we are almost 15 minutes over. I think we've gone through all the questions that we've taken in from the chat, as well as ones that have come in during registration. I do want to thank everybody, Tony, Abby, and Addison. I really appreciate you being willing to share your expertise and contribute to this discussion. There's clearly a ton more to talk about, and we can't cover it all in one hour, but I will give folks one last chance. If they do have additional questions, you can feel free to throw them in the chat now. And while people are thinking up those ones, I will put in one more plug for the continuing webinar series. We have one coming up in 2 weeks, which is related to our discussion here, but a little bit more focused on tubing systems and forest management and approaches that sugar makers have taken to make it more likely to do management as they have a tubing system up. And feel free to register for that and all the other great webinars we have planned for the next few months. I don't see any other questions. I guess that means everyone is feeling fairly satisfied with everything's been answered, so that's great. Tony and Abby and Addison, I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much for joining us, and hopefully we will talk to you guys soon.
Thanks, Mark. See you, Abby. See you, Addison.
See you guys.
Thanks. Take care.
You.